You're just the assistant, right? His smirk was slow, confident, like he thought he'd already figured me out. I forced a polite smile, the kind that doesn't reach your eyes, while my blood simmered just beneath the surface. My dad's so-called friend, Gregory Shaw, leaned back in his leather chair, swirling a glass of whiskey like he owned the room. To him, I was invisible, a young woman tasked with running errands, booking meetings, and making sure his world stayed convenient. The nerve. The audacity. He had no idea who he was really speaking to. I had spent years in the shadows, the quiet one at every family gathering, every business dinner, every networking event. My dad trusted me with simple tasks, never suspecting that I was trained for far more than scheduling calls or fetching coffee. Unit 77 wasn't just a tattoo, it was a symbol, a mark of a skill set Gregory would soon wish he never underestimated. The moment of revelation came by accident, or maybe by fate. I reached for a file on the edge of the mahogany desk, and my sleeve rode up. Gregory's eyes caught it instantly. Unit 77. Black ink curling across my forearm, sharp and unmistakable. The smirk froze, the glass wavered in his hand, and suddenly, the entire dynamic in the room shifted. "Wait, what is that?" he asked, voice tight now, tinged with something closer to fear than curiosity. His confident posture collapsed just a fraction, like a king noticing a pawn with fangs. I shrugged innocently, letting the moment hang. "Oh, this? Just a little something from my past," I said, my tone casual, the kind that masks a storm brewing beneath. But Gregory's reaction told me everything. He'd assumed weakness, invisibility, and now, just like that, the illusion was shattered. My dad, oblivious as always, chuckled, patting Gregory on the back. "Don't worry about her. She's just helping me out today." But I knew better. I had always known better. The unease wasn't in my dad, it was in Gregory. His gaze kept flicking to my tattoo, calculating, nervous. Something told me he was trying to assess whether I was a threat or just a curiosity. The rest of the meeting passed in strained pleasantries. Gregory made a few more attempts at casual domination, little jokes, thinly veiled orders, but each time, his eyes betrayed him. He was watching my hands, my posture, the slight twitch when my mind began mapping possibilities, analyzing weaknesses. I left that room with a quiet satisfaction, though a flicker of unease lingered. This man didn't know me, and that was dangerous for him. And yet, he was clever, experienced, and arrogant. He assumed he was untouchable, that Unit 77 was just a mark, nothing more. He didn't realize I wasn't just my dad's assistant. I was something else entirely. Something he was about to regret underestimating. The game had begun. And I intended to win. After that meeting, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Gregory's eyes haunted me, not in a supernatural sense, but the way a predator studies its prey, calculating, measuring, planning. He had underestimated me once, but I could feel him adjusting his strategy, like a chess player thinking 3 moves ahead. The red flags started subtly, almost imperceptibly. My dad, usually so blunt, seemed unusually eager to please Gregory, bending over backward to accommodate his whims. Every business dinner, every contract meeting, my father deferred to him, sometimes in ways that seemed excessive. I began noticing the small favoritism, the way Gregory's suggestions were treated as gospel while my input was brushed aside. It stung, not because I craved recognition, but because I could see the pattern forming, a web being spun quietly around us. Then came the secret calls. Gregory would step out of the room, phone pressed tightly to his ear, speaking in hushed tones that always ended with him smirking or laughing. He claimed they were old contacts, nothing important, but his energy was different afterward. The way he glanced at me afterward, eyes narrowing ever so slightly, gave me chills. Something was brewing, and it wasn't professional advice. Money issues followed soon after. Dad's accounts, usually meticulously managed, were showing discrepancies, transfers that didn't make sense, small amounts here and there vanishing into accounts I couldn't trace. Gregory's influence was everywhere, and it was starting to cost me, not in direct money, but in trust, in access, in the feeling of security that had always been implicit in our family business. The unfair treatment wasn't limited to finance or decisions. At work, Gregory would delegate minor errands to me while keeping the real opportunities for himself. He acted as if I were a placeholder, a shadow, a quiet observer meant to absorb orders without question. But every task he gave was calculated, every dismissal a small test to see if I would falter under pressure. Emotionally, it was exhausting. I was constantly walking on eggshells, pretending to be the obedient assistant while my instincts screamed that something bigger was unfolding. Every day felt like a performance, every smile a mask. The more I observed, the more I realized how deeply entangled Gregory had woven himself into my father's world, and perhaps even into my father's trust. And yet, I couldn't pinpoint the betrayal. Not fully. It hovered just beyond my grasp, like a shadow in the corner of a room. Was it greed? Manipulation? Or something darker? My mind replayed that moment, the flash of recognition when he saw my Unit 77 tattoo, and I remembered the flicker of fear in his eyes. He knew something about me, something I couldn't yet reveal. It was infuriating and exhilarating all at once. I was trapped in a delicate balance, forced to play the part of the obedient assistant while my instincts screamed that the game had only just begun. And I knew that sooner or later, the truth of Gregory Shaw's intentions, and my own capabilities, would collide in ways he could never anticipate. The evidence hit me like a punch to the chest. I had followed the breadcrumbs carefully, piecing together emails, transaction records, and whispered conversations. And then it became undeniable. Gregory Shaw wasn't just scheming for professional gain, he had been manipulating my father into signing over control of our family's assets, siphoning influence and wealth from me without a hint of subtlety. It started with the trust fund. My father, once proud and meticulous about our family estate, had been convinced that Gregory's guidance was necessary. Every suggestion to restructure accounts, redirect dividends, or adjust inheritance lines had been orchestrated to elevate Gregory's hold while keeping me in the shadows. And my dad had signed it all, blindly trusting his old friend, assuming I would remain the obedient assistant, unaware of the machinations at play. I felt my stomach twist as I read the emails where Gregory casually referred to me as the girl who doesn't need to know anything yet, his arrogance dripping from every word. Every smile he had offered at dinner, every polite nod when I suggested alternatives, had been calculated to maintain the illusion that I was powerless. And the tattoo, my Unit 77 mark, wasn't just a surprise for him, it was a silent warning that I wasn't as naive as he assumed. I slammed the documents onto the desk, rage and disbelief warping my vision. How could my father, my own father, allow this man to strip me of what was mine? The heartbreak was sharp and biting, mingled with a furious pulse that made my hands shake. Gregory had treated me like a pawn in his personal game, and my family had unknowingly been his accomplices. The betrayal was not just financial, it was emotional, psychological, and deeply personal. Every laugh he had shared, every small dismissal, every orchestrated favor to make me feel secondary, it had all been part of a larger plan to erode my presence, my influence, my claim to what was rightfully mine. I paced the room, heart hammering, mind racing. I could feel the adrenaline sharpening my focus, burning away the initial haze of shock. Gregory thought he had me figured out, thought he had successfully diminished my standing in my own family. But he underestimated the resilience that Unit 77 had instilled in me. I had been trained for situations like this: betrayal, deceit, manipulation. And now, armed with evidence and strategy, I was no longer the assistant. The question that hovered over me was simple but lethal: how could I turn the tables without tipping my hand? Every step I would take needed to be calculated, precise, and devastating. Gregory's arrogance was a weapon I could exploit. He believed he was untouchable, and that would be his downfall. I clenched my fists, staring at the tattoo that had become my silent badge of defiance. The betrayal had cut deep, but it had also lit a fire inside me. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. And when I struck back, Gregory Shaw would wish he had never underestimated me. The game was on, and for the first time, I felt a cold, exhilarating clarity. He had made a grave mistake, and I was ready to turn it against him. Stared at my reflection in the office window, watching the city lights blur through the glass. My chest felt heavy with anger, betrayal, and disbelief, but beneath it, a spark was beginning to flare. Unit 77 had taught me many things, but one lesson was always clear: in moments of betrayal, hesitation is the enemy. You either act, or you lose. The realization hit me like lightning. Gregory Shaw, the man who had smiled in my face, mocked my assistant status, and manipulated my own father into undercutting me, wasn't invincible. He thrived on arrogance, on the belief that people underestimated him. And that, my friends, was exactly what I could turn against him. I replayed the scene in my mind, the smirk he wore when he thought he had me figured out, the subtle condescension in every conversation, the casual dismissal of my presence at meetings. I had let his arrogance linger in my mind too long, letting anger cloud clarity. But clarity had returned. And with it came a steely resolve. I wasn't just fighting for respect. I was fighting for my inheritance, my family legacy, and the truth that had been stolen from me. I sat down at my desk, hands trembling not from fear, but from the surge of focus. I began listing every interaction, every email, every suspicious transfer. Each small move Gregory had made wasn't just random, it was a map of his arrogance and overconfidence. I realized I had more tools than he imagined: access to financial records, knowledge of family contracts, and the loyalty of people he assumed were inconsequential. The trigger moment came when I found the email thread where Gregory had suggested adjusting the inheritance to favor himself, and my father, unsuspecting, had agreed. I felt a cold, furious clarity. This wasn't just business, it was personal. My father had been manipulated, yes, but Gregory had counted on my silence. That silence ended tonight. A smile crept across my face, not the timid, polite smile of an assistant, but the confident, controlled smile of someone who had seen the full board and knew their next move. I was no longer hurt. I was deliberate. I was patient. And I was ready. I made a silent promise: every underestimation, every attempt to sideline me, every whispered dismissal would come back to Gregory tenfold. He had underestimated the wrong person, and that mistake would cost him everything he thought he could take. With that resolve, I drafted the first plan. Step 1: gather irrefutable proof. Step 2: expose his lies without giving him a hint of my strategy. Step 3: make sure the world, and my father, saw the truth in all its clarity. I leaned back in my chair, letting the calm determination settle over me. The pain of betrayal had sharpened into focus, and for the first time, I felt untouchable. The game had shifted. The hunter had become the hunted. And I was ready to strike. I became invisible on purpose. To Gregory, I was still the assistant, quiet, efficient, forgettable. I booked his meetings, organized his files, smiled when he dismissed me. He mistook compliance for weakness. That was his second mistake. Step 1 was proof. Not suspicion. Not instinct. Evidence that would survive scrutiny. I audited everything Gregory touched. Expense reports. Advisory fees. Shell consultations that led nowhere. I worked late nights, cross-referencing timestamps and metadata, tracing where money moved after my father signed off on Gregory's recommendations. The pattern was unmistakable. Gregory had positioned himself as a gatekeeper, quietly redirecting authority and compensation toward entities he controlled. He wasn't stealing outright, he was bleeding us slowly, surgically, counting on trust and ignorance to protect him. Step 2 was corroboration. I reached out to people Gregory ignored, junior accountants, legal assistants, old vendors he treated like furniture. Unit 77 had taught me something crucial: power always overlooks the quiet ones. A few careful questions, a few shared concerns, and doors opened. I learned Gregory had pressured others too, coaching them on what not to document, what to phrase vaguely, what to handle verbally. Every conversation was logged. Every document duplicated and encrypted. He had built his scheme on the assumption that no one would connect the dots. I was connecting all of them. Step 3 was the trap. Gregory loved control, especially public control. He thrived in meetings where he could dominate the room, correct others, perform authority. So I gave him an opportunity. I suggested, casually, that my father host a strategic review with external partners. A chance for Gregory to show leadership. He agreed instantly. Of course he did. He even asked me to prepare the materials. I prepared 2 sets. One was the polished version Gregory expected: clean numbers, selective summaries, his preferred narrative intact. The other was the truth: transaction trails, conflicting advisories, internal contradictions he hadn't noticed because he never expected anyone beneath him to look closely. Meanwhile, Gregory still felt untouchable. He joked about training me up someday. He called me kid in front of others. He even remarked, once, that tattoos were usually compensation for lack of substance. I kept my sleeve down and my expression neutral. The tension built with every passing day. I could feel it in my chest, that tight coil before impact. One wrong move and he'd sense the shift. One slip and he'd close ranks, destroy evidence, rewrite the story. So I waited. The meeting was scheduled. The room was reserved. The attendees confirmed. Gregory thought he was walking into a victory lap. What he didn't know was that the stage was set, the spotlight was unforgiving, and the assistant he had underestimated was about to let the truth speak, loudly, cleanly, and in front of everyone who mattered. And when it did, there would be no way for him to talk his way out. The boardroom was silent, the hum of air conditioning the only sound as Gregory strode in, chest puffed with the confidence of a man who believed the world was his. He glanced at me, a fleeting smirk crossing his face, and I let my sleeve slip just enough to reveal my Unit 77 tattoo. A subtle reminder. A warning. "Good afternoon, everyone," Gregory began, voice smooth, practiced. "I trust everything is in order for today's review?" I nodded politely, passing out the folders. But inside, each one held the truth he had tried to bury: clear evidence of misappropriated funds, emails where he had coached my father into signing over authority, and transactions routed through shell accounts tied to his personal ventures. Gregory's smirk faltered slightly as the partners began flipping through the files. I could see the change in his posture, the slow realization that this was not the narrative he had rehearsed in front of the mirror. "Excuse me," he said, his voice tighter now. "Where did this information come from?" "From the documents you left behind," I replied calmly, letting the room absorb the impact. "And from conversations others were willing to share." "It seems your instructions were not as discreet as you thought." Gasps echoed around the room. Partners exchanged glances, nodding slowly, their trust eroding as they digested the meticulous evidence. Gregory's face turned red, and for the first time, he looked genuinely cornered. He tried to argue, weaving excuses and blame, but each claim crumbled under the weight of the paper trail. Every lie he had used to manipulate my father, every false assurance he had offered, was exposed in stark, undeniable detail. My father, sitting at the head of the table, looked shell-shocked. Gregory's betrayal had been personal and financial, but the public exposure cut deeper. He had humiliated my family, undermined my authority, and manipulated the trust we had placed in him. Now, the world, and my father, knew the truth. By the end of the meeting, the outcome was clear. Gregory was stripped of all influence over the family accounts. Legal teams were engaged to recover misappropriated funds. His reputation, carefully cultivated over decades, had been shattered in front of those he had aimed to impress and deceive. As he gathered his things, muttering threats and excuses, I caught his eye one last time. No smirk remained, only the raw panic of a man who had underestimated someone he thought powerless. I closed the folder and placed it gently on the table. Calm. Controlled. Triumphant. Unit 77 had served its purpose, not just as a mark of past training, but as a symbol of my resilience, my patience, and my capability to turn betrayal into victory. Gregory walked out, defeated, humiliated, and completely exposed. I finally allowed myself a small smile, feeling the tension in my chest release. The game had ended. He had thought he could manipulate, deceive, and control. But he hadn't accounted for the person who always watched, always listened, always prepared. This wasn't just revenge. It was justice, executed with precision, and it felt perfect. The dust settled slowly, like the calm after a storm. Gregory Shaw's empire within our family was gone, stripped away in full view of everyone who had once deferred to him. Legal action recovered the misappropriated funds, and the board reaffirmed my role in managing our family's assets. My father, though still grappling with his own guilt, finally looked at me with respect, not just as his daughter, but as someone who refused to be underestimated. In the weeks that followed, the sense of victory settled into something deeper, empowerment. I walked through the halls of our family estate with a confidence that had been denied to me for years. Colleagues and family members approached me with genuine recognition, some apologetic, some awestruck. The Unit 77 tattoo, once a quiet signal to Gregory, had become a symbol of strength and resilience. I didn't need to boast. I didn't need to gloat. The truth had spoken for itself, and the repercussions for the betrayer were undeniable. Gregory's calls went unanswered, his emails ignored, his carefully cultivated reputation ruined. People who had once admired him now questioned his ethics, his judgment, and his character. The man who had believed he could manipulate my family had been undone by his own arrogance, and by someone he had called an assistant. Yet the most satisfying part wasn't just his downfall, it was the reclaiming of my own life. I could finally move forward without fear, without deceit lurking in the shadows, without the weight of stolen trust pressing on my shoulders. I had learned a powerful lesson: strength isn't just about fighting, it's about watching, waiting, and striking when the moment is right. And as I looked at the skyline from my office window, I allowed myself a quiet smile. Gregory Shaw had underestimated me in every possible way. The irony, sweet and sharp, lingered. The man who thought he could control my family's wealth and manipulate my father had been undone not by force, but by precision, patience, and courage. To those watching this story, I ask, have you ever faced betrayal that cut deeper than words? Have you ever been underestimated by someone who thought your presence was insignificant? Share your story in the comments. I want to hear how you reclaimed your power. And remember, always respect the underestimated. Because sometimes, the quiet ones, the observers, the assistants, they're the ones who can change everything. If you enjoyed this story, hit subscribe for more real-life tales of resilience, strategy, and poetic justice. After all, in the end, the lesson is clear: underestimate the wrong person, and they will become the architect of your downfall.